into the chat. I'll keep an eye on that too. Otherwise, we'll work through it. And then if you have questions at the end or anything you want to talk about regarding the revisions you're currently working on, especially since there's just two of you, that's really easy to kind of think through and talk through. And then, of course, hopefully this gives you something that you can take from here and like bring to the Writing Center staff that you're working with. And so it just gives you a little bit more of something to talk about as you work with them. Okay. Oh, so I like to start off talking about revision by just asking, what does revision look like for you? Like, what are parts of the process, or do you have a process for revision?
I can go first.
Yeah, sure, thanks, Eddie.
I think for me, I just write a lot and then I kind of give it a few days. I think you've also given me that advice. So I give it like a few days, or maybe like a week or two, and I go back and then I edit and then I like reread it to see. I think waiting a bit is good instead of like just revising the whole thing.
Yeah. It's probably a little self-serving to say since I didn't give you that advice, but yeah, that's a good part. So giving yourself a bit of time to refresh your brain. Good, cool. Zachary, do you have any particular strategies when you revise?
I tend to do it probably the wrong way, in that I tend to kind of, when I write, it's a very like winding process, I guess is the best way to describe it. Like I'll write like a paragraph and then I'll be, okay, this doesn't flow very well. And then I'll kind of revise that, and then I'll go to the next, and then I'll add the next paragraph and then revise that.
Yeah.
Or, the next like segment. And so by the end of that draft, it usually, like the first draft, I'm used to writing, college essays where, you only have a limited amount of time. And so I try to cram as much revision into the first draft as possible, so that if I get, it's a habit, like, so that if I end up not being able to work on it later, that first draft is still relatively acceptable.
Right. And so totally understandable. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just rambling now. Sorry.
No, you're good. That's exactly what I was asking for. Just a sense of like when you kind of sit down to write and try and revise, what does that look like? And for a lot of college writers, it looks like a lot like what you described, Zachary, right? Especially when you have that compressed time frame. It's really hard to work in revision. It's even harder. All the institutions I went to as a student were semester long, so the quarter is an incredibly small time frame to actually like write something and then revise it and be able to like substantially kind of make progress on a draft. So that's totally understandable and not at all uncommon. That's how most people write. So for a lot of college writers, here's what the process of kind of writing and revising looks like. Usually you'll read your prompt assignment instructions. Maybe you're confused about it. Maybe you have to talk to an instructor or come to the Writing Center and talk about it. You'll think about how you want to respond to that. You might outline a few ideas if you're someone who likes to do outlining or pre-writing. You'll probably choose a few quotes from your source material, whatever you're working on, generate a thesis statement or kind of, main argument for what you're working on. You might write a rough draft at that stage. If it's part of the class or you just like to share that rough draft, you might take it for peer review or instructor feedback. Oops. You'll probably make some small changes after you have that peer review or instructor feedback, or like in the SOP process when you work with your Writing Center or SOP staff person, your writing specialist. And then you'll probably edit your draft for things like typos, word choice, etc. And that's often what it looks like. You'll submit your final draft. That's a pretty common structure for folks, and there's nothing really wrong with that per se. But what it mostly boils down to is you read your prompt, you write your rough draft, you do a bit of editing, and you submit your final draft. Like I said, this isn't necessarily wrong. There's not someone determining here's the right way and here's the wrong way. And writing processes are often very personal and very individualized. But we do know that writing in this way has some disadvantages. And the biggest disadvantage is that it doesn't leave you room for revision. Because in this kind of process, revision doesn't really happen until you get to number 8 and 9, right? So the very, very end of the process, that's probably when you don't have a lot of time left either. You might have like at most a week, maybe a few days, maybe not that much time at all. Maybe it's like a day turnaround time. So the challenge there is particularly, I mean, in a compressed quarter, but thankfully with the SOP materials, you have the luxury of having a bit more time and having a bit more space to do some actual revision. So it doesn't just have to happen kind of at the end. Now, another thing that we often run into is students will often kind of conflate revision with editing. So what is revision? The simple version is that revision is what you do when you're really trying to substantially improve your writing. Not just when you're trying to kind of clean it up a little bit or like change the wording or the sentence structure, but when you're wrestling with like the core ideas, the arguments you want to make, the kinds of evidence you present, all of that stuff. The organization and structure, you know, how you kind of lay things out for your reader. That's what revision is. It's really big stuff. Is there a thing? I thought there was a thing for editing. Maybe it comes later. Sorry about that. All of that is opposed to editing, which is generally more kind of superficial, more kind of polishing stuff that happens at the end of the process. It's important, but it's not as important as revision. That said, revising can be exhausting. These are courtesy of one of our grad admin fellows, actually, whose name's. And the thought of revising might make you feel like exhausted, frustrated, especially if you don't have a lot of time left and you kind of recognize, oh gosh, there's still a lot to work on or fix. That can be really frustrating. But something we're going to kind of talk about in this workshop is how you can tackle that just as part of the process of writing in general. And not something you necessarily have to wait till like the end when you have 2 days before your deadline to work on. This is the slide I was thinking of. So first you want to recognize, like I said, that revision is different from editing. Revision is going to focus on what we sometimes call higher order concerns that are like the big pieces. They matter a lot. Things like organization, analysis, argumentation, and the materials you write for the SOP, you know, these are going to be things like how well your personal statement communicates who you are and your commitment or skills or experiences and how they're relevant to the award or fellowship that you're applying for, right? Revision isn't just something that happens at the end. It should happen kind of continuously throughout your writing process. So Zachary, when you talked about kind of like writing some and then revising a bit, there's actually nothing wrong with that. It might feel a little circuitous, but that's okay as long as you're kind of tackling it in a way that's productive for you. And revision is going to change and improve your paper in major ways. Editing, on the other hand, is going to focus on smaller sentence level concerns. So like I said, things like grammar, punctuation, sentence structure, your word choice. You absolutely should edit. I'm not saying you should do revision at the expense of editing. Ideally, you do both. What we're talking about today is how to make sure you do both effectively, especially revision, because that's often the part that gets kind of left out. The most important thing to note about editing is because you will often change so much across your writing, particularly in these kinds of documents that you're working on for SOP, you don't want to edit until the very last stages of the process. Once everything's in place, once you feel like everything's organized, all the major parts of what you want to communicate in your personal statement or whatever materials you're working on, once all that's there, that's when you want to edit. And that's where you kind of clean it up and make sure it's readable and all the, you know, the grammar and sentence structure is all good. Editing can change and improve your paper, but it's often in very minor ways. If somebody feels like they don't get a sense of who you are in your personal narrative, you know, for the Night Hennessy or something, editing is never going to fix that, right? So the takeaway is that editing your draft is not the same as revising it, and if you really want to improve your writing, you have to focus on more than just those sentence level concerns. Now, how do you do that? What are some of the elements of revision? Some of these are a little less applicable because you're not writing an assignment, but there are a lot of ways that they can still apply to the SOP, right? So you're almost always going to have some kind of prompt or requirements that you're trying to meet. It's really good to make sure as you revise that you're going back to that and checking in on it. You want to try and improve your structure and coherence. This is really, I'll talk about this with students as like readability or accessibility for your reader. So can they kind of read it top to bottom and understand what you're trying to communicate? Do they feel like they're being taken along on that kind of journey across whatever you're writing? you probably won't have a thesis statement, but I mean, to that same end, like whatever kind of crystallized ideas or like concepts you're trying to communicate, particularly in those personal statements, you want to make sure those are really specific, that they're explicit and obvious, because these documents are often read sometimes really quickly, sometimes just skimmed, unfortunately. So you want to make sure there's it's not kind of a buried thing. Analysis isn't really that applicable to what you all are doing, but integrating all the different kinds of experience, the skills you're talking about, the things in your life that have shaped you and that are relevant to talk about these awards applications. Making sure you're paragraphing appropriately, right? So you're not trying to jam 15 different experiences into one paragraph. And developing your writing style or voice, right? So making sure that you feel like what you've written accurately reflects and kind of comes across in the voice you want it to.
In addressing counter arguments, I would think that one of the things for our awards is that it's more, you know, if you're applying for a Fulbright or applying for like a Rhodes and Marshall, why do you need to go abroad to this place? Why can't you do it here, UCI, University of Chicago, wherever else? Why do you have to go to Spain or to Oxford or to, you know, fill in the blank place? Like that is something that you want to make sure is addressed. And if it's not addressed, then that could be an argument in someone's head for like a counter argument that in someone's head for why your statement isn't as compelling as somebody else's.
Yeah, that's a great connection, David. Thank you. Now, when you're editing, and you can think of these as kind of potential checklists as you're working through the materials, right? Things you're going to do when you edit, you're going to add sentence variety. You're going to make sure you're using like the right words, right? So choosing accurate and clear vocabulary. You'll adjust your formatting if there are formatting requirements. That's a good thing to talk to David and Teresa and Rose about, because I'm not going to be as familiar with if there are formatting requirements. Any minor typos or errors, you want to tackle those at the end. Something we sometimes see with students in the Writing Center is, even if they're still at the beginning stages or very much in like the middle of revising, people will get really caught up on things like grammar. They'll get caught up on whether they're spelling everything correctly or using the right punctuation. You do want to tackle that, but at the end, because if we do a lot of changing in that, kind of cleaning everything up, and then you end up deleting a whole paragraph and writing something different, it was just kind of wasted time anyway. So that's why we want to tackle those big revision level considerations first, and then hit editing stuff. This is when you'll do a lot of trimming, especially I know all of these awards have word limits or character limits. So I always tell folks, like, don't worry about that stuff in especially that first half of the drafting process and revising process. When you get to editing, that's when you can start to figure out, okay, how do we like get rid of 20 words here so we can get to the word limit. But you don't want to try and do all this at once. This is overwhelming. There is a lot happening here. You don't want to try and sit down and in a 2-hour, setting, write everything, revise everything, and edit everything all at once. It's pretty difficult, if not impossible. So what should you do then, especially when you have a longer timeline, like most of you do with the SOP materials? You want to think about it in terms of different kinds of drafts. So trying to achieve different kinds of goals with where you are. Right now, I imagine probably both of you are either still working on or just starting to move past your ideas drafts, right? And that's when you're just trying to figure out what it is you want to say. It's your first stab at some ideas, depending on what kind of fellowship or application you're doing. You might be talking about some very personal things. You might be trying to figure out for like the Soros, what is my relationship to my identity as an immigrant or child of immigrants? How do I kind of frame that for other people? This is where you really just want to kind of spill your guts all over a page and figure out what it is you want to say. And it's okay if it's not exactly correct, because you've got, especially with these materials, you've got a bit of time to work through it and think about it. And that's what you want to do up front. You don't want to be like trying to structure everything, trying to edit everything. You just want to get your ideas out. So once all the pieces are in place, you can move on to something like an organization draft. So once you know what all you want to say, that's usually when you want to move on to, okay, in what order am I trying to say it? Or how do I want to structure this to make sure that my reader understands, exactly how I'm trying to communicate my identity or my experiences, who I am, all that kind of stuff. I was just talking a little bit earlier, actually, with one of the SOP folks about a lot of folks will get caught up in something like trying to write things chronologically. I actually really encourage you all to think about things like thematically or conceptually, because you can always create links. And sometimes just from like when something happened is not the best order to describe it. If, for example, you're not starting with the most impactful experience at the top of that kind of essay.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's partly my fault. It's not because.
No.
No, the brainstorming workshop, one of the things when we're talking about just like brain dumping and you just want to get words on the page, what's a quick organization structure is just go chronologically. And you can, and then my advice to them is when we get to revision, you can always rearrange it. We can always figure out,
Yeah.
okay, this is the thing to start with.
Yeah. That's totally fine. That's where, I mean, that's where we are now, right? So
Yeah,
if they
yeah.
get it all out in the ideas draft, and that's what, when I was talking with Owen earlier, we were talking about, great, you've got all the pieces, now let's figure out what the best way to arrange them is, right?
Sure. So, you might have seen that because that is part of my advice in the early stage is just put it all on a page. And if you need some framework, because you just can't figure out, time is an easy framework. We
Yeah.
all know this happened and then this happened. But as you're saying now, those aren't always the most compelling things to read in the, as we get closer to revising and final.
Yes. Yeah, and it's a very natural way to start, right? We tend to think about stories and everything in like terms of linearity, what happened first to what happened last or most recently. As you move on from your organization draft, so you've got kind of all your ideas, or at least most of your ideas, you're starting to figure out in what organization you want to put them. Then you want to think about, okay, what is not getting told here? What's not getting understood? Or what could I kind of beef up? This is the point usually when I'm working with SOP folks where we start to talk about like, is this kind of a less is more situation? Do we want to focus in on like 2 or 3 really important experiences and cut these other 2 kind of less important experiences that they'll probably see in like your resume or your CV anyway? Those kinds of things, really trying to figure out how do we maximize the impact of what you're writing and make sure it's the best it can be, that you're presenting the best material and information. And then finally, you start to get towards that editing phase. So once everything's kind of there, this is usually, and this is sometimes scary to hear, but probably a good 4, 5, 6 drafts in sometimes, depending on how much work you do and how much you feel like you need to revise. But once you start to get kind of where it feels like it's about 80, 90% there, that's when you start to look at, okay, how do I make sure that my sentences, I'm not using the exact same kind of sentence structure or words over and over again? How do I make sure my punctuation makes sense, my word choices make sense, et cetera? So that's the stage where you start to get to editing there at the end. Just to note that you don't have to do these things like top to bottom. There's a lot of moving back and forth. You might do a lot of ideas drafting and then start to move into organization, and maybe you meet with one of the SOP writing specialists or one of the writing center staff and find out, I actually need to kind of go back to the idea stage a little bit because I'm not entirely sure. And it's totally possible the first 2 or 3 ideas drafts you have, you end up scrapping a lot of that because it's just not quite the thing you want to communicate. It's not quite that thread you want to put all the way through, right? And that's okay. There's no rule that says you have to move kind of in an orderly progression across these drafts. Most people move back and forth across them. When students meet with me, we'll often do a bit of talking, we'll do a bit of talking about ideas and thinking about it as an ideas draft, but we'll also probably spend a little bit of time talking about it as an organization draft. That's just what happened with Owen and I. We both talked a little bit about the ideas, but also how would you order these things, or like, what are you starting to think about in terms of presenting this to your reader? So that's totally okay. And they more or less often kind of move from like rough draft to final draft. But again, there's a lot of moving back and forth across these things. This doesn't mean you have to write 4 different drafts necessarily. You all probably will write at least 4 because of just the nature of the materials and what you're working with. But like I just said, most of the time you'll find yourself doing these different things in each draft. So you'll probably be working on ideas and organization and maybe some enrichment, potentially all at the same time, as you kind of figure out what it is you're trying to say and you get feedback from the SOP folks and from the Writing Center folks. you just want to know that you're open to the process. You want to recognize like, okay, when you sit down to think through this stuff, what is it you want to work on and what can you bring to the table in the sessions with the SOP writing specialists and with the writing center folks. Some tips for figuring out what exactly you should revise in a given moment. First, you want to try and figure out what drafting stage you might be in or stages. So are you really still trying to nail down those ideas and those concepts, what it is you want to talk about? Or do you think that's mostly there and you're mostly trying to figure out how do I organize this? Or if that's mostly there, you know, how do I kind of move into that enrichment stage, make sure it's really being presented in the best way possible, that I've got the best kinds of ways of framing my experiences, et cetera.
We also have one more person who joined, Ella Jin. I don't know if you saw.
I did not. Welcome, Ella. This is recorded and also we'll share the slideshow. So we're just talking about right now how to figure out where you should revise, or sorry, what you should revise with where you are in the process. And feel free to toss any questions into chat if you have any. So yeah, it's important to be honest with yourself and kind of acknowledge like where you actually are in the process. A lot of times you might feel like I would really like to move on to the organization or enrichment draft, but if your ideas aren't all there, you're potentially just doing a bunch of work on things that you won't end up using anyway. So you want to be honest with yourself and choose where you actually are, not where you think you should be. You want to pick your specific goals based on the stage you're at, the prompt or rubric for, the assignment in your all's case for the fellowship or award that you're applying for. Any feedback from your instructor? Oh, I don't know why I did all that. Feedback from your peers, tutors, specialists. We often, or I will often ask students when they bring a draft, especially like the SOP folks, we'll hear this from me if you work with me, but I'll ask you like how you feel about something. Often we kind of know like, this just isn't quite there, even if you don't know how to describe like what is wrong with the draft or what you don't like about it. You'll often know in your gut, like it's just not quite right. That's a really good place to start to think about revision and to bring to your writing specialists and the folks at the Writing Center, right? So we can help you figure out what it is that's not quite right and potentially even like give you a kind of second opinion and tell you why we think it might not be right, or maybe we feel better about it than you do, and we can kind of talk through that. When you sit down to revise, you always want to go in with some kind of plan, ideally with where in your draft you should focus your attention. So are you trying to work on specific paragraphs? Are you trying to work on your introductory sort of opening part? Whatever it is, it really helps to sit down with some idea of where you want to put that time, because you often do have limited time. And then obviously you want to just dive in. Just because you want to go in with a goal doesn't mean you want to like stick to it super rigidly. If you feel like if you're trying to think or work about something, other parts of the draft are just kind of sticking points for you and you can't get past them, that's okay. Lean into those parts that are really sticky for you so that you can kind of try and work on the thing that's most concerning to you in that moment. And that's always revision. That's the process. So, for the three folks today, we have plenty of time. So thinking about whatever you're working on right now, we're going to give you a little bit of time, but we'd like you to generate at least one specific revision goal. This might be something you bring with you to your next SOP writing specialist meeting or with the Writing Center folks. But with what you're working on, what is one goal? What's one thing you want to accomplish? You want to think about where in your draft you need to look to begin accomplishing that goal. So where are you going to go? If you have a draft with you or have access to it, you might think about taking a little bit of time to highlight or underline those areas of your draft to kind of make sure you know or make a comment or something to draw your attention there when you come back. And then ask yourself, what do you need to revise in this space to make your writing more accessible and or impactful for your audience? So take about, let's see, I say like 8 minutes, a little more than 5, a little less than 10, to generate a revision goal, look for it in your draft, and then ask yourself what you need to revise here. If you spend about 8 minutes doing that, you've already set yourself up to do good revision for yourself and or to bring a really good revision goal back to your writing specialist or your writing center. Help. And feel free to approach this as flexibly as you need to. If you're working on ideas, that's okay if you don't have a specific spot in the draft. But I've set a timer for 8 minutes, so just take a little bit of time to kind of reflect and think about where you want to revise next with the materials you're currently working on.
If you have any questions or need Evan to clarify, or myself to clarify anything, feel free to either type it in the chat, or you can also just speak up and let us know.
Mhm. Take about 2 more minutes. Identify your revision goals, figure out where you will start to look in the draft for those goals and what you need to revise there. Okay. Go ahead and wrap up your thoughts. Just some final tips and strategies. You all probably know this, especially working on the SOP materials, but it's always good to go back to the prompt or, well, if you're running an assignment, the assignment, but for these particularly, whatever prompts you have, looking back at it every time you sit down to revise can be really helpful. Sometimes it's really easy to forget, one particular thing they ask about or one element or to do a lot of work that then ends up not quite connecting with what the prompt is asking you. So I always recommend just glancing back over it when you sit down to revise. Another strategy you can use, especially once you've got kind of a full draft and you're trying to figure out how do I organize this and is it, is what I'm talking about in each paragraph relevant or useful? You can construct what we call a reverse outline. And that's where you just generate a 1-sentence summary of the main idea of each body paragraph and kind of write it out in the margins or, if you're in a Google Doc, make a comment or something. If you're not able to kind of look at each paragraph and tell, kind of write down in a single sentence what that paragraph's main point or main idea is, then you might have too much in that paragraph. That might be a really good sign that you need to break them up. It's also a good kind of strategy when you're looking at organization, because once you produce that kind of 1-sentence framework, you can then see, okay, does it make sense to have this main point in front of this main point for my reader? Reviewing the topic sentence of each body paragraph to make sure that it signals the main idea of that paragraph, especially in these application materials. Something you really want to work on as you get into kind of the back half of the revision process is making sure that all of your paragraphs connect and flow really well, especially if you're talking about kind of like, in one paragraph, you might be talking about your experience in your lab. And then the next, you might be talking about an experience for like community service that you used to do. It's not always apparent how those things kind of like flow into each other. And to be fair, like they're pretty different experiences, but you want to make sure they're connected somehow across your topic sentences and the final sentences of each paragraph. Look for signal words that or phrases that reveal logical relationships or transitions between ideas and paragraphs, right? So in the example I just gave, I mentioned like your lab work versus maybe community service work you do. Maybe you see those two things as helping different kinds of communities. One of them is a community of knowledge on campus. One of them is kind of an actual community in your neighborhood or something like that. And that's a good, that is a way to kind of connect those things and build a transition that makes it easier to flow across. You do want to be careful of kind of like overselling it. So there is such a thing as like trying too hard to build that connection. Sometimes you want to, there's just a kind of sweet spot you want to hit of connecting the things, but moving on and not spending a ton of time trying to make these things seem related to each other. And you also want to ensure that signal words reflect the relationship that you want to portray. So this is a little less applicable for you all, but these might be kind of like cause and effect or contrasts, explanations, whatever that is, you want to make sure it connects for you. At the end of each body paragraph, you might want to reread, not your thesis in these materials, but kind of your opening paragraph. What's your main kind of crystallization of your concept or idea or theme that you're trying to get across for your reader? Is there a connection? Does it connect across every paragraph? If not, that communicates something that you need to kind of go back and make sure that each paragraph is feeding into this overarching idea, just like a thesis for an essay. And then ask yourself why you put each paragraph where it is. There should be a reason. You should be very carefully curating the kind of experience and narrative that people are working through. If you're not sure why you would kind of put this thing in front of this thing, you might want to try and think that through and maybe talk about it with your writing specialist or your writing center person. Like, how do I figure out how to organize these? One good initial strategy I recommend a lot is, what is, in your opinion, the most impactful experience related to what you're talking about to least impactful? That's just a good way to get started. And it also helps you figure out how to rank kind of those experiences. And if you need to lose some words, if you need to lose more than like 50 words, for example, it's really hard to do that. Just kind of cutting and trimming across an essay or statement. You're probably going to have to actually just like remove something. And if you ranked those experiences from most impactful to least impactful, it's really easy to just look at it and say, okay, I'll just take the least impactful thing away. Because you've already kind of done that ranking. It doesn't mean it's not important or relevant to you, and you should obviously still care about that experience. It just means you have to make a little bit of room, and that's a good strategy for it.
This is what Teresa and I mean when we say things like, this paragraph isn't doing any work for you. It's just it's there, it's taking space in your writing, but you don't need it, or maybe you've already said that idea and now you're just saying it a different way, and or it's just not as impactful as starting with, something an essay I read yesterday, like the most impactful sentence was in the third paragraph, and that should be your first sentence. In your whole first paragraph, I suggested didn't need to be there at all. And those are the types of things that we're talking about you're doing when you're revising, is you're looking for that kind of hook or the thematic moment that you can then kind of thread throughout.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then finally, you want to think about, especially when you're getting into the editing stage, the impact that your smaller choices can have. So things like punctuation, how you structure your sentences and sentence length can all have a really big impact on how your ideas come across and can affect the way your reader interpolates things. So be thinking about that. Be thinking about how you can use them to your advantage.
So what I wanted to do real quick was just talk about, so how does all of this map onto the SOP timeline? And so this is something that you saw when we did the kind of the introduction to the SOP process and the video introduction and the quiz that y'all took, that we outlined this kind of map of exploration and mapping, and then trailblazing, which is why we call this the T10 of the trailblazers. And then, and keeping the metaphor alive, kind of what's the view from the summit. That's kind of our the map outline that's on our website. And then how does this work in terms of what you're actually doing and turning in terms of Canvas assignments? And so you've gone through most of the journal entries now, and most of the journal entries fit into the exploration process, in which we did a lot of brainstorming and mapping and outlining. And that's why we started off with the brainstorming workshop as our first workshop, because all of that is to lead you to the creation of draft one, to get your ideas on the page, to be in that first stage that Evan showed earlier. But now that we're past draft one and we're kind of more into, we're more in the woods, if you're doing the hiking metaphor, starting to go up the mountain. Now you're making revisions, and all of these revisions should lead to draft 2 for us, but it might be draft 6 or 7 for yourself, where you're really thinking about, do I really want to start the essay in this way? Do I want to do it chronologically, or does it make more sense to do it this way? What is the most impactful theme that I might be able to carry throughout? Those are all the types of questions you might want to ask yourself. And in terms of revising strategies, revising goals, like, okay, I'm going to do this revising goal this time I read through it. I'm going to do this revising goal the next time I read. And that's one of the things that I myself have found really helpful about working on this with the Writing Center with Evan and going through this material that Emma put together, was just thinking about different revising. Revising isn't just like a one-time thing. I'm revising today. I'm going to do this time around. I'm going to revise it, and I'm going to focus on a different goal next time I revise it. And I think that's really helpful. I never thought about that before myself. And then in terms of the difference between revising and editing, after you turn in draft 2, and particularly for those of you that are working on Marshall Mitchell Roads, Fulbright, that have endorsements, and you're going to have an endorsement draft and you're going to have an endorsement meetings. I still kind of consider, even though we're going to try to get it as final form as possible to that point, you're going to get a lot of feedback in those meetings. And so you're going to then, you're going to probably revise and edit. And then after you get all those comments from the endorsement meeting, then you're going to go back to revising mode again and change a lot of things. But ultimately, when we get to September, October, and we're getting closer to when things are due, we don't want to be in the, okay, let's delete 3 paragraphs, let's add more. That's what we want to be in, the line editing, the grammar, and that sort of stuff, so that we can feel comfortable, hitting submit and being done and celebrating your accomplishment.
Absolutely. Okay. That is all I have. Do you all have questions about revision or things you'd like to talk about as you've been trying to work on your materials and revise? Happy to answer any of those questions or help you think through some thorny problems you might be having. And feel free to toss those in the chat or to come off mute for folks who are on Zoom.
So yeah, to answer Ella's question about the previous workshop, the brainstorming workshop, I did share the PowerPoints. Actually, the email may have come from Teresa, but we shared the PowerPoints for that, and we shared an overview of kind of what we talked about and how to use them. But we didn't record that one because a lot of people were sharing a lot of their kind of personal stories and things of that nature. So that's why that one's, you can go through that email to see how we use those slides and to read those prompts, but that one's not been recorded.
Other questions? I'm also always just curious to hear like how the revision process has been going for folks, if that's a little easier to talk into. It's not necessarily a direct question, but how have revisions been going for you all as you've been kind of meeting with your writing specialists from SOP, with the Writing Center folks, and starting to revise?
I did have a question, but I was just
Yeah,
gonna ask.
no, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna ask if after the recording is over, because it's like more personal.
Sure,
like,
sure.
paper, but I can also share.
It's something, if you were gonna kind of like ask me, since I'm your Writing Center person, we can do that after too.
Okay, yeah.
But if it's like a broader thing, if like you can frame it more broadly, it might also help. Other folks might have the same question, but I don't want to force you to share if you're not.
I can share.
Okay.
My revision goal was that I wanted to kind of make I wrote out everything already, but I wanted to make mine more personalized, so that was my revision goal. And I wanted to kind of tell a story about like who I am and then leading up to like why I'm applying, kind of like what you said about like why that specific program. But my question is, I think I'm a little confused at like the goal and I've kind of lost sight of the vision. So like my question is, am I trying to like convince them why I'm deserving of this award, or am I trying to convince them like why I'm different than everyone applying, or is it like none of that and it's just like telling my story?
Is that for the Knights Hennessy or for sort of,
Kind of for both.
or both?
Like what, like I'm answering the prompt, but like at the end of the day, like what should I have like a goal of what I'm trying to do through my writing, or is it just more like telling them who I am?
Like, that's a really good question. I think that you want to convey who you are to like, are you and your story represented there in what you're writing? And also like why that award, why that place, why that research, why that matters to you as a person and to like your future goals. I think that's easier than trying to, because when you're thinking about, well, why I'm unique, or like you start to then compare yourself to other people, and that can get in your head, and that can get in your way. Then you start thinking, okay, well, I have this story, but it's not going to be as good as this other person's story, and that really can hinder your writing process. So more in terms of what are my dreams and visions? What do I care about? And is that being conveyed here? How would receiving this award connect to those goals, those dreams, those visions? And is that being conveyed in my writing? I think that's more personable and also less kind of getting in your own head in terms of like comparing yourself to others.
Thank you.
But yeah, that's a good question, because these prompts, I mean, reading the Knight Hennessy prompts, for example, there's tons of questions they're asking you. And you obviously don't have the room to answer every single one of them. I know a lot of people just like to, okay, I'm gonna answer this first question, and I'm gonna answer the second question, and it's okay to do that during the first phase, the kind of brain dump phase. But you eventually want to have a compelling piece of writing. And it's hard to quantify, always what makes something compelling and what doesn't. But if it just reads like you're answering a bunch of questions and the paragraph have no cohesion to each other, there's no thematic thread or no sort of story connecting it. Oftentimes you might look better on paper resume wise than somebody else. But if your writing isn't compelling, then, people who are often reading these things really quickly might not be as inspired.
Yeah, I think everything David said, I would agree with. Sometimes when I'm meeting with folks and they kind of like bring some of these prompts, and they are like weird prompts, and they often ask you like to account for yourself in a way that you've probably never had to like think or reflect on necessarily before. Like it's very rare somebody just walks up to us and asks us to sort of like share who we are with them and like how we've been formed by like our communities or the people we know or the experiences we've had. Like you just don't often have those conversations with people. So it feels weird, it feels very personal, and it's also just tough to know what to say. So that's why, like a lot of, Ivy, I think you and I talked about this a little bit when we met, but I usually just start by asking, like what's important to you? Most of these applications are in the context of like grad school or some kind of like next step. And just to ask like, why do you want to do this thing? And like, what are the feelings that are important for you that you're chasing by doing this thing? And how can you kind of communicate that to another person, not just saying, I want to help people or I want to teach English or I want to develop this knowledge, but like, what do you get out of that? And how can you kind of communicate that effectively to another person? I often think it's less, the experience in and of itself that people are looking to see, and more just how much it feels like it comes genuinely from you as a representation of who you are. So even if it feels like the experiences you're describing are kind of mundane, if they're kind of communicated in the right way, if they feel very much like they come from straight from your heart, and communicate who you are, that's the most important thing. Maybe even sometimes a little more than like, do they exactly answer every question of the prompt? So that's my recommendation. The computer just told me my battery's running low, so I'm just gonna grab my charger real quick,
Okay.
but I'll be back. I know Ella tossed a.
Yeah, it's too much to talk about my childhood experience, and you're not gonna let me answer, it depends. It really depends upon how much what experiences you're highlighting. Does it fit into a broader theme that you're trying to carry throughout your essay? And then how much room and space do you have? Because obviously you don't want to spend, if you only have 2 pages or something along those lines, you don't want to spend the whole time talking about like childhood stuff. And then, you're 2 seconds at the very end of the paper. And this is why I then went to UCI, and then now I want to do this. Because then it's like, okay, so I've learned a whole lot about this one moment in your childhood, or these 2 moments in your childhood that I don't know, if it's not related, then you don't have to talk about it. Yeah, oh, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, for that, I would have to get more into what about it. And this is not something that you have to share if you don't want to in like the chat, but just like, what about it is interesting? Why do you want to share that? And then maybe we can connect that to like a broader theme. It just really, that's why I'm saying it depends. Like, and also Knight Hennessy does have, if you're applying for that, which I don't think that you are, Ella, but like Knight Hennessy has one of those, it's not really an essay, but it has those questions
The
about.
8 important, or the 8 unique facts or whatever they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll get like really profound ones, but some of the ones I've seen submitted, sometimes people overthink those because people will also put stuff like, I've been to every state, or I've been to every capital, or,
Yeah.
so sometimes people will overthink those.
Mhm. I don't know, if this is helpful advice, Ella, but I'm often actually I lean pretty hard on anecdotes, in a lot of these statements. Not because they're not useful or valuable, but I think sometimes folks kind of think the whole statement should be like that childhood story, or it should take up like half of the statement. And in my opinion, those like anecdotes or stories from your childhood or your adolescence, or even like your time in college, are most useful as these kinds of like encapsulations of like what the idea or the theme you want to get across is. So like anytime we work with students who are working on like, especially like med school personal statements, it's very, very common, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with this, but like the most common thing you're going to see is an anecdote that opens the statement about a family member who got sick and how that impacted them and made them want to be a doctor. And that's great, but it's also an extremely common experience, and it's the most common way people frame that experience. So if somebody brings an anecdote like that, part of what we talk through, and this gets back to kind of what I was saying about your question, Ivy, and that's just like, how did this impact you, and how did it drive you individually? How did it shape like the actions that you took? Not just like, I wanted to be a doctor, but like you came to UCI. Why UCI? Or, was there a particular reason for that? Sometimes there's not, and that's okay. But like those anecdotes, whether they're from your childhood or somewhere else, are really useful for communicating like, here's the main point of my thing. I had an experience with a dying family member, and that led me to want to pursue this thing. And that's a decent starting point. I'll always push beyond that, but that's what the anecdote should do. It should wrap up in a kind of single summation. Here's why this is important. The story in and of itself, I don't think is that important. Sometimes there's also, I think, a real danger, particularly with the Soros, for folks to kind of try and find like really like traumatic or like complicated or difficult narratives to tell. And while those can be absolutely valuable, and if that is what you want to share, that's totally fine. But there are a lot of folks who are kind of like, I feel weird trying to put like my childhood trauma on display to try and like win an award or something. And that's okay. You don't have to do that. That doesn't have to be how you frame your anecdote, particularly if you don't feel like your experience, for example. I see this a lot in the Soros. Like I've just had some students who say like, I feel like a lot of the examples I see are very driven by like trauma or obstacles. And I feel like I want to approach my experience as an immigrant or child of immigrants as a positive one, as a one of growth and value rather than sort of negative.
Right. Yeah, we both worked with a student recently that's who literally said, that's not who I am, I guess. And so we encourage the student to think about, well, if your experience, what are the positives that you got from being a child of immigrants and from going through what you went through, and how did that shape how you viewed what you were learning differently, and then viewed going to college in a way that's unlike your peers. And all of that still stems from being a child of immigrants, but it was like seeing things in a different way, in a positive direction instead of in a negative direction. But talking about anecdotes, I like starting off personal essays with anecdotes, and I don't know if you hate that, so.
No, I like them. I just don't ever, they're not the end all be all, right?
Sure.
We tell stories like to impart lessons or make a point. And in the same way, like that's how you want to use them in these materials to serve a broader purpose, to communicate something about who you are or what drives you or why this award or experience is important to you.
Right. I mean, it can't just be tell a story. It has to be something that is integral to the theme that and the point that you're trying to accomplish. But even, I think this little mini argument about anecdotes is helpful is that there's no way to know who your readers are going to be. And your readers are probably going to be people like Evan and myself who, maybe I'll see an anecdote and think this is great, and Evan will see an anecdote and think, oh, maybe you should have used it in a different way. Potentially. And that's why it's really not helpful for you to try to not to think about other people other than yourself when you're writing these essays, because you can just get in your head so much that not just comparing yourself to other applicants, but also trying to figure out who's reading it and what do they want. That's when you get into that. You may have probably all heard the phrase analysis paralysis, but that's when you get into that problem, and then it can really derail your writing instead of just being your authentic self.
Absolutely. Yeah. Other questions? Anything we can help with on revision? Yeah, I'll just say, I guess actually this advice about revisions, it's really because it's geared more towards like this particular stuff, but Ivy had mentioned it earlier. So I also always really encourage, especially for folks who are working on something like personal statements or like the kinds of materials you work on for the SOP. There are ways you can kind of make good use of the meetings you have with the SOP specialists, with the Writing Center folks, and also good ways you can make use of break time. So something I'll sometimes see, especially on like personal statements as folks are applying for grad school or these material or, these awards or fellowships, is people will just like kind of relentlessly be looking at them and always trying to revise them, and just like constantly, it just kind of like consumes people. And especially, SOP does such a good job of making sure you all have deadlines so that you kind of stretch this process out all the way across the summer. My recommendation is when you have meetings with folks and you get that great feedback and you're kind of like charged and you feel like ready to go change something, my recommendation is to definitely within the next day or so, make those changes, make a lot of those changes, as many of them as you can. And then just put the draft aside for a little while, for at least a few days. If you can put it aside for a week or two even, I recommend that. Partially because if you spend all that time looking at it, you stop being able to tell what's like a good change and what's just like kind of tinkering around with it. So our brains get really tired of looking at the same writing, and you get kind of just like lost in it after a while. So you want to give yourself some breaks from these materials, or maybe like if you have 2 awards, kind of play them off one another, like spend a bit of time on one and then take a break and start looking at the other, so that they're, you're kind of not just looking at the same thing all the time. But something we'll see a lot is folks will just be looking at these things like almost every day, and that's just frankly not helpful from a writing standpoint. You need a rest, your brain needs time to kind of just like settle. And then when you come back to that draft, you'll also usually notice it's a lot easier to tell, like, okay, here, like, I did really well with these paragraphs. These paragraphs definitely still need some work. And you can then take that back to, the Writing Center or your SOP specialist and get more of that feedback to then kind of start that process over again. So.
I had a question for you.
Uh-huh.
So can you give any sort of, I know that you asked them to come up with their own revision goals on the
Yeah.
basis of kind of where they're at, but can you give some examples of what a revision goal might look like?
Sure. It really depends on like where you're at in the process and what you feel uncomfortable with, but or what you do feel like you're doing well, and vice versa. A like revision goal that is probably pretty common for these is probably something like addressing every element of the prompt, for example. If you feel like I'm not addressing the entire prompt, I want to make sure I get to this point in the prompt. Something at this stage I spend a lot of time talking with people about is just, can you tell me in a single sentence what like the main point of your statement or narrative or whatever the longer form materials are, like what that is. If you have a really hard time just telling me like, here's what I want my reader to get in a single sentence, it means you probably need to spend a bit more time thinking about it and find that kind of very crystallized form, like that crystallization of your idea or theme. That's a lot of what we spend on here. Other stages of the draft, you might be thinking about organization. So like I said, am I presenting information in the most impactful order? I need to look back and figure out what's the most important experience for me to relate here to, like least or the order I want to get them in. Those are some examples. There's also some other things like working on transitions, working on specific phrasing. When you start to get closer to the end, a lot of that stuff starts to become revision goals. But it really just depends on like where you're at. And I would say a really good strategy, I'll sometimes do this with students when I'm working on them, especially if like I haven't had a chance to read over a draft. And so I need like 5 minutes to read your draft. Sometimes I'll just ask the student, I want you to tell me what are 2 or 3 things that you feel good about in this draft, like since you've made revisions and updates, and what are 2 or 3 things you just know kind of like you don't feel great about or you want to make sure we look at today. And you can use that yourself too when you sit down to revise. Just ask yourself, what are 2 or 3 things in this draft? I'm going to read through and then ask myself, what are 2 or 3 things I feel good about? I think I'm doing well. And what are 2 or 3 things I feel like I need to pay attention to here? And that might be like, this particular paragraph is just like not working out, or I've got too much in here and I need to break it up, or I'm just way over the word limit and I need to kind of rank and figure out what experiences I need to keep.
Right. So and since we're not going to be doing, and since one of the main points is having revision goals, don't do all this at once.
Right.
That's why revising is in many ways the longest step.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah, ideally, or should be if you have time off. But yeah, why there's not really a draft 1 and a draft 2, even though that's what we have in the schedule.
Yeah.
There's multiple revising goals along the way. I don't know if you want to share just the next.
Oh, yeah,
the
sorry.
last 2 slides.
So yeah, I think all of you have probably already met with your assigned writing center sort of mentor. But if you haven't, this QR code will take you to our website, or should. If it doesn't, our website's also up there, writingcenter.uci.edu. And you can make an appointment with us. I'll also say for the SOP folks, you get direct access to Writing Center folks, but you can also make additional appointments if you want to keep working. We have lots of openings, especially at this part of the summer with our professional staff. And so it's pretty easy to make an appointment. And even if you like work with Percival, there's nothing that says you can't also make an appointment with like Jesse or Talia to work with one of them on something. And sometimes that difference of perspectives can actually be helpful. You can learn something from it. Because, you know, we, just like you all are approaching the writing in your own style, in your own way, we have different styles and ways of kind of helping you work on that writing and giving that feedback. So sometimes you might like vibe a little better with somebody's style than someone else's.
And that QR code takes you to the campus group page, but since there's not a lot of you, I checked you in all manually myself while
Okay.
Evan was talking. So I think that we're good. I'll stop recording.